This is The Baseline, discussing the hot button topics of the NBA.
Welcome, everybody. You are tuned to The Baseline. Cal Lee, Warren Shaw, discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. About 20 so more games left in the docket. And we are definitely running on all cylinders now, fully back in the swing of things. This past weekend, it was like 14 games in one night. I mean, talk about basketball overload, but it was great basketball nonetheless. And we got some great topics lined up and some really great conversation pieces to put on the table. And we can't wait to get into it. So, you know how I like to do. I like to roll out my intro with my right-hand man, 50 grand NBA aficionado, Don Mad contributor, writer for one of the illest websites, www.shawsports.net, Big Kahuna and PNC. My man, Mr. Warren Shaw, repping out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Despite a quiet trade deadline, Shaw, how much noise are you making to this weekend?
I'm chilling, my dude. I'm chilling. I'm just enjoying the NBA being back in full swing, as you alluded to. And, you know, first of all, as always, salute to all the fans and listeners of the NBA Baseline. We're very happy that you're back with us here post All-Star. It's going to be a great end of the season as we get into some of the buyouts, you know, the WAC trade deadline we've already discussed and all that. But, you know, we have lots of NBA news to discuss, and we have two great teams that we want to discuss and one special guest that's really going to help break things down for us here, bro. Yeah,
man. Great show we have lined up. We've got our man, Zach Bennett. He covers the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Minnesota Lynx at ColdOmaha.com. He's also part of the Hardwood Paroxysm Basketball Network. And you know how those guys do, man. They are like the social media moguls of basketball, Lowe, Harper, those guys. So it's great that we got our man Bennett on. He will be helping us talk about the Minnesota Timberwolves, one of the most exciting basketball teams that is definitely on the come up. And while these struggles are happening, we definitely have our eye on what might be focused for this team. So we can't wait to get him on in the next few moments. And then our segment of the drop, man, another team that has been kind of flying under the radar, but always a great topic of conversation, just not with the personnel, but also from a management perspective, the Atlanta Hawks. Did what they didn't do help this basketball team moving forward? Great topic piece for us to have in our segment of the drop. And of course, our coveted coast to coast, where we discuss everything happening in the association. So across the board, great show we have on tap for you. And again, we always appreciate our fans and listeners of the Baseline continuing to throw those headphones on and allow us to be your go-to resource discussing all things in the NBA, available on all the major platforms, iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Player FM, and Microsoft TuneIn. So download any of those if you are now just catching up with us, and allow us to be your go-to resource discussing all things NBA. You know how to get at my man Shaw at Shaw Sports NBA, or get at me at GameFace Lee, and the show's Twitter handle at NBA_the baseline, hashtag up the baseline. Available also on Rabble TV, as we just did this past weekend during the trade deadline. This past week. So be sure to check us out as well, too, throughout the rest of the season and also going into the playoffs. Go to www.rabbletv.com, put in the Baseline NBA podcast, and we will pop up and we'll be live and directed as scripted. You know how we do, and you know how we like to set things off. It's time now, guys, for the breakdown.
Time to break it
down to the bone gristle.
Time now for the breakdown. Cal Lee, Warren Shaw of the Baseline NBA podcast. This week, we have a really great guest on with us who's going to help us talk about a team who, when you look at them face value, I mean, they are really on the precipice of really kind of shaking up the NBA, but in a really positive way. The talent there, it's ready to bust. And I think given what we're going to see for the sample size of the next 25 games or so for the rest of the season and going into next season, we definitely do not want to sleep. But we do know that there's some things that we are very curious about on whether or not this is a team that's going to look the part and hopefully will play the part. We got our man, Zach Bennett. He covers the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Minnesota Lynx at ColdOmaha.com. And you can also catch him running with our boys at Hardwood Paroxysm Basketball Network. Zach, thanks for joining us here to talk about the Minnesota Timberwolves, man.
Hey, no problem. Happy to be here and talk about what I spend most of my life doing.
Well, what we want to know, and it's obviously for people that don't have an opportunity to really kind of catch up and see what's happening with this Minnesota Timberwolves team albeit outside of NBA All-Star Weekend when Zach LaVine is out there winning slam dunk contests and the big cat is winning skills competition. When you look at this roster, this is a really talented roster. And even though they've only won 17 basketball games, all that being said, the real curious question is, what is it going to take for this Minnesota Timberwolves team to really, really show out? And I know you're covering this team. You've seen them since, training camp, basically, what their potential can be. Can you talk a little bit about what should people be expecting to see from this Minnesota Timberwolves team as we kind of round out towards the end of this season?
Well, unlike last season, in which they landed the number 1 overall pick, that was used to obtain Karl Anthony Towns, they're actually competitive in games this year. I depend pretty much on statistics just because I feel it's an accurate way to relay the points I try to make. Unfortunately, I don't have how many games they've been close in, but I can tell you it's remarkably more than they were competitive in last season. You're going to see inexperience. You're going to see some pretty freakishly athletic plays, dunks and things like that from LaVine and Shabazz Muhammad, and Ricky Rubio does Ricky Rubio stuff, but a lot of the Wolves' struggles derive from a lack of depth at power forward, and not so much a lack of depth, but a lack of good, healthy power forwards and inexperience. So you're gonna see some mistakes, some stupid mistakes, some silly mistakes, some head scratching losses like the one last night to the Knicks, and then before the All-Star break to the Pelicans. But you're also going to see some impressive wins, like before the All-Star break when they beat the Clippers and the Chicago Bulls. Granted, the Clippers and Bulls, respectively, were without Blake Griffin and Jimmy Butler. The Wolves, it doesn't matter who they're playing every night. They're in a position to be competitive in every game.
Listen, the Timberwolves are one of my favorite young teams out there. I had a chance to join a media call at the beginning of the year, and I asked Jeff Van Gundy what he thought about the Timberwolves compared to the Orlando Magic. And I said, which young team would you rather be? And his answer made sense at the time in terms of he'd rather be the Magic because they're in the Eastern Conference. But I think the Timberwolves have so much young talent, so many great pieces that are busting at the seams to develop. That leads me to one player in particular. You covering this team on a regular basis, are you comfortable with the development of Andrew Wiggins, or do you think he should be further along? I know we're only in year 2 right now, but did you expect him to be doing a little bit more offensively and defensively for this Minnesota Timberwolves, or is he being stunted by the overall talent that's on the roster in general?
If you had asked me this at the beginning of the season, I would say that Andrew Wiggins, I would have expected more from Andrew Wiggins than what I've seen thus far. But with the emergence of Karl Anthony Towns, I don't think Wiggins will ultimately, if the Wolves are going to get where many believe they are going to go, I don't believe Wiggins necessarily needs to be, a 15, 20 point per game guy. Where I get frustrated with some stages of his development is with rebounding and his passing, and the archaic offensive system that Sam Mitchell runs, which I'm sure we'll get into, doesn't put him in a lot of positions to, a lot of the times he's losing out on assist opportunities because he's making a pass out of a double team that ends up being the pass before the pass that gets to the shot. So he's not getting those assist opportunities. He's not the greatest ball handler, so he's not really a drive and dish kind of guy, and his outside shooting is nowhere close to what it needs to be. So from an offensive standpoint, I think he certainly underachieved as far as expectations that many had for him prior to his arrival in the NBA, but he does a lot of good things while on the court defensively, and over time he's going to have a lot of opportunities to improve in those areas. So there's still time. I don't think he is where he needs to be right now. I don't think on the grander scheme of things he's going to need to become such a potent offensive weapon if the Wolves are going to succeed, simply because they have Shabazz Muhammad and Andrew Wiggins and Karl Anthony Towns. All of them have proven to be pretty good scorers. So if you have a guy like Wiggins for a long time, I'd like to compare him to Chris Middleton over the border in Wisconsin and Milwaukee. Chris Middleton is a far better three-point shooter, and he's a little bit more savvy if that makes sense. But he defends the opponent's best scorer on a night-by-night basis. And when you're doing that, offense doesn't always come easily, and I think that's what we need to remember with Wiggins.
Zachary Bennett joining us here, covering the Minnesota Timberwolves at ColdOmaha.com. Be sure to catch him on Twitter at ZacharyBD. All right, Zachary. So I'm trying to let this thing flow as best as I possibly can, and you brought up some really great points just now in this last segment. But we got to jump on this because this is the conundrum that has just beaten me upside the head. And no disrespect to people out in Minnesota who love them some Sam Mitchell, but you just mentioned it a moment ago when you said this archaic system that he has on that he has these guys playing on, and I keep scratching my head about this. You know, where does the Sam Mitchell factor come into play when we're talking about the development and the growth process for this Minnesota Timberwolves team? Because my concern is you have Wiggins, you've had Rubio, you've had Muhammad, you've had Gorgie Dang. These are guys that have been around this culture, so to speak. And I know what happened with Flip Saunders that definitely, kind of adversely affected the process. But what we're seeing here, I just don't think 17 wins constitutes nearly enough what I could think that these guys are capable of doing if they probably was under a better foundation coaching wise. I don't know. Maybe I'm just completely speaking out of turn, but who better to probably put me in my place than you right now, my man?
It is always worth wondering how much better the Wolves could play with a different coach. Coaching in the NBA is such a broad thing to analyze, and there are only, I'd say, maybe 5, no more than 10 great NBA coaches. I know Brad Stevens and Rick Carlisle are 2 of them, and then there's Greg Popovich. But as we've seen this year, a lot of coaches are losing their jobs. So with Sam Mitchell specifically, what a lot of people tend to forget is that this is the same offense Flip Saunders ran last year. It's no different. And Flip took a lot of heat for that, I think, but he had the benefit of being the president of basketball operations as well. So his job was never really in jeopardy because he would be the one to have to fire himself if that's what it came down to, and I don't think he was going to do that. So when Flip died, it was, I remember on September 11th, they had a press conference to announce that Sam Mitchell would be taking in and that Flip Saunders would be stepping away. And this was right before training camp. So the Wolves never had time to search for another coach. There is the element of the assistant coaches, one of them being Flip Saunders' son, Ryan, as well as David Adelman's son and Sidney Lowe. And, the assistants in place before the season were, they're under contract. They weren't going to go anywhere. Glenn Taylor is a notoriously stingy owner. He's actually interested in selling the team, which I don't think is any secret by now. And he, a penny pincher isn't going to hire a coach who's going to bring in another group of assistants to, only to fire the ex-president of basketball operations son and some guys that he's known very well. So the way I put it is this: Sam Mitchell interviewed for the job for the New Orleans Pelicans coaching vacancy prior to the season, the one that was ultimately given to Alvin Gentry. And that team has underachieved as well. But if Sam Mitchell lands that job with New Orleans, who knows who would be coaching the Wolves right now? Probably Sidney Lowe, but the Wolves could definitely be in worse shape under certain conditions. And a lot of the complaints that many have about the offense were the same under Flip Saunders as they are Sam Mitchell. What Sam Mitchell has done well, I believe, is, he's managed everybody's health. You see, Kevin Garnett has missed a lot of games because he's old. Nikola Pekovic as well. And then Nemanja Bjelica has had some trouble experiencing the physicality of the NBA game. But all of the young guys, especially with Karl Anthony Towns, with the way he has deployed them, he hasn't done them any sort of hindrance on their bodies physically. He's kept them healthy. And I think that is an underrated thing, whereas somebody like Tom Thibodeau, who is by all accounts a better coach than Sam Mitchell, is notorious for running his players into the ground. So with somebody like Thibodeau, you wonder whether all of these young guys could withstand a hefty workload and things of that nature throughout the length of an 82-game season. But I think Mitchell has done well on that, to that extent.
All right, Zach, real quick, Shaw, before Zach, I got to ask you this though, because I'm looking at like to me, I believe that a good reason why some of these coaches right now are being fired is one, the relationships that the coaches have with some of their players, preferably star players. I mean, we've seen the situation that happened with Jeff Hornacek and Markieff Morris and how certain guys lose the locker room. Derek Fisher in New York. I don't think it's so much the fact that guys don't respect Sam Mitchell, but what I look at is rotations. I look at who is on the basketball court at critical times, who fans want to see playing basketball. And I got to tell you, there are people that are on this roster that, no disrespect to what they've accomplished in their careers, shouldn't be on the basketball court. Tayshaun Prince is averaging 21 minutes a game. I don't understand that. Tayshaun Prince is like 50 years old. And those are minutes that could be given to guys like Shabazz Muhammad, who's a shade around 20. You know, it's just it boggles my mind because I don't know if whether or not this is the process you want some of these guys to go through is watching on the bench. We're seeing how guys like Byron Scott is taking scrutiny for sitting guys like Julius Randle and their number one draft pick, D'Angelo Russell. I'm looking at, you're just talking about how some of these guys are really quality guys, but they're not on the basketball court nearly enough for us to make that assessment. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I'm going to disagree with you on Tayshaun Prince, and I'm going to cite my reasoning why. Sam Mitchell before the season said that Tayshaun Prince and Kevin Garnett would start because he intends for his team to start games on a high note. And in his defense, the starting lineup of Ricky Rubio, Andrew Wiggins, Tayshaun Prince, Kevin Garnett, and Karl-Anthony Towns this season has, in 276 minutes played together over 25 games, logged a net rating of 10.7. That is by far the best net rating of any Wolves lineup to play over 100 minutes. To your point, the Ricky Rubio, Shabazz Muhammad, Andrew Wiggins, Gorgui Dieng, and Karl-Anthony Towns lineup in 51 minutes has recorded a net rating of 27.4. So it's nearly double. Granted, it's a smaller sample size. What the logic is behind playing Tayshaun Prince so many minutes is so that Andrew Wiggins can play the shooting guard, or he can guard the smaller of an opponent's two wing players. And when you have guys like Wiggins and Levine who are young, Levine has, played a lot of minutes at point guard this season, but playing them down a position conserves their bodies in terms of longevity. They're not going to be matched up against the LeBron Jameses and the Paul Georges and, the physical wing players that are becoming more and more common in the NBA. Tayshaun Prince is willing to do the dirty work and guard those guys. You saw it last night with Carmelo Anthony, even though nobody on the Wolves could stop Carmelo Anthony last night. I mean, the goal there with Prince is to take some of that, physicality away from Wiggins and Levine and conserve their bodies throughout the 82-game season and beyond. You don't know what the lasting effects of any injuries to them at this early juncture of their careers could have moving forward. So while Tayshaun Prince doesn't seem to be the most flashy player, and he's missed a couple dunks in embarrassing fashion at the rim, he does a lot of the dirty work. And I think, if anything, Sam Mitchell should get credit for taking the long-term approach, which might not necessarily be what's best for him and his coaching career, but in terms of the Wolves, what's best for the Wolves and the long-term future, he's certainly bit the bullet and doing some things that others potentially wouldn't in order to conserve, the potential that this team has going forward.
All right, so I have a two-part question for you here, Zach. Kind of piggybacking on the veteran leadership here and something that the Wolves, I guess, didn't do. So you're around the team. Tayshaun, Andre Miller, KG. Can you talk to us a little bit about their actual effect off the basketball court, how they're affecting these young guys, and how, I guess, because some people thought it was overkill, maybe you don't need all three of those guys, but you have all three of them. Are all three of them making a significant impact off the court? Because I've seen a lot of stuff with KG talking to Cat, and he seems to really have a good relationship with him. And the second part of this question is, are you surprised the Wolves did not make a move to release a guy like Kevin Martin or Pekovic, to try to potentially, get those guys freed up a little bit?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think from what I can tell, obviously KG has had a huge impact on Towns, and that was a big reason for KG sticking around the team, I believe. He signed that 2-year contract in the offseason. He's had a lasting impact on Towns. It's obvious by the way Towns plays. You know, when the Wolves offense is going towards the hoop near their bench, you can hear every time any player gets the ball, really, KG's yelling, all day, all day. And he's basically an assistant coach in the huddle. And yeah, I mean, his leadership is tangible to what, you can see it. KG, you don't have to worry about it. Admittedly, I was not a big fan of the Andre Miller signing. He's the oldest player in the league. Behind Ricky Rubio, the Wolves don't have a backup point guard. You look at it, and it's Zach LaVine, who is a better two guard, and Tyus Jones, and then Andre Miller. Tyus Jones is too young and small. Andre Miller's too old and slow, and LaVine's playing out of position. So you're stuck there. But Miller seems to do what a little bit of what KG does in terms of sideline leadership and being in, LaVine and Tyus Jones's year on the bench, from what I can see, not to the extent and detail that KG is, but in his own way, yes, I believe he's contributed off the court in a sort of mentorship role. Tayshaun Prince, there was a couple of weeks ago after a game, Prince and Andrew Wiggins were sitting beside one another in the locker room and sort of going over defensive concepts and movement. So, I mean, if I'm ordering them in terms of what they bring to the table as far as mentorship goes, it's KG, Andre Miller, Tayshaun Prince. Prince does a little bit more on the court in terms of playing time and what he does offensively and defensively, but he's the lowest on the list as far as mentorship leader goes, from what I can tell. And that's a very hard thing to analyze from my perspective. And then the second part of the question was a trade deadline move. I'm sure that they received calls on Ricky Rubio. It didn't sound like they got anything that they wanted. They've been shopping Kevin Martin, or they had shopped Kevin Martin for over 2 months. I think mid-January, a report surfaced that the Wolves had made him available on the trading block, but it appeared that nobody wanted Kevin Martin. Now, they have yet to entertain talks of a buyout with Kevin Martin, which I think could happen. It seems unlikely, going back to my point with the penny-pinching owner earlier. But the second part of your question is really fascinating, if only because the death of Flip Saunders put the team in a weird spot. Honestly, I can't say that Milt Newton, who is the team's GM, has any authority to make any trades or any roster decisions.
I was just about to ask you about that. In relation to that, is where does Milt Newton fit in this quote unquote transition, so to speak, and where his powers lie?
Well, he worked with the Wizards for 10 years. He also worked at the league offices, and from my understanding, he had a lot to do with coordinating the D-League, and when the D-League was getting started, he had a big hand in that. He's very much, I think he's good with cap stuff, but he worked in the player development office with the Washington Wizards for quite a long time, which is where he developed a rapport with Flip Saunders. But the word was, in Washington, a lot of the front office and the brain trust there ignored what Milt Newton had suggested, or a lot of his suggestions. And ultimately, Washington, throughout that time, made a lot of blunders and mistakes. How much of those would have been avoided had they listened to Milt Newton, nobody can really be sure. But for them not to really honor his opinion is concerning in itself. And let's not forget that when Flip hired Milt Newton, the GM, more likely than not, he was getting a guy who he wanted to do. I'm sure he thought Milt was a great dude and deserved a chance to move up to the general manager ranks and things like that. It's his first general managing position. But at the same time, nothing on the surface indicated that Milt Newton was ever going to surpass Flip Saunders in terms of power within the organization. And, I don't think that they had ever clashed head to head, but if they did, I don't think Milt Newton would come away as the winner with the job if it came down to that. I think he would have left if there was any spat between those two. So it is worth wondering what type of power Milt Newton has within the organization. And I think from all the reports, locally and nationally. Glenn Taylor intends to sell the team. Steve Kaplan is a name that's been thrown around. There's also the possibility of Garnett and Jimmy Jam forming an ownership group to buying the team. But Flip Saunders was going to be a big part of the next ownership group that was going to buy the Timberwolves. And with him passing away, a lot of that changes. You don't know what Kaplan or any other potential ownership group will do once they come in, how long it will take the new ownership group to accumulate and acquire all of the power to make coaching decisions and things of that nature. So the Wolves right now, this season is basically a holding pattern. Make sure nobody gets hurt. Try to instill in the players good habits and teach them how to win. Garnett and the veterans are certainly on the surface helping to do that, but there does seem to be, according to an Associated Press report written in January, a rift between some of the players and Sam Mitchell. And if that is to get any worse, it puts the team in a tight spot, especially if the general manager can't make trades or hire a coach. And if the owner can't sell in time, it just puts everything in sort of a weird spot. But for now, they're in a holding pattern.
So go ahead. Let me jump in real quick before I let you get out of here real quick. So we're talking about a holding pattern with the ownership group and kind of where do you see this, I guess, kind of lying with the players? I feel like everyone looks at Wiggins, looks at Karl Anthony Towns as these are the two main guys who are going to be here for the long haul. But then my question for you is, Ricky Rubio has been on the trading block. You've mentioned Shabazz Muhammad as a guy who's going to be a key piece. Gorgui Dieng is also here. Zach LaVine. Of those four guys, who's the next piece? Who's the next most important piece if you were going to form a big three of the Minnesota Timberwolves?
Zach LaVine.
Yeah.
Going back to your point about the trade deadline, and I'll try to tie it in with this question, I definitely think the Wolves should have fielded calls on Gorgui Dieng and Shabazz Muhammad. Now, I can't say that they didn't field calls on either of those players. I know during the draft, teams had called inquiring about Gorgui Dieng, and they basically hung up the phone right away and said, we're not doing that. And with injuries to Pekovic and the front line, it's a good thing that they didn't. But, with the Wolves likely getting another lottery pick in the upcoming draft, they're going to have 8 players who are going to be on, first round contracts, and they're not going to be able to issue all of them maxes. So you have to start thinking about, Levine and Muhammad and Dieng, especially with the emergence of Karl Anthony Towns. Which one of those guys becomes expendable, and do you trust your staff to go out there and make a free agent acquisition or a pick in perhaps the second round of upcoming drafts to fill those spots? Because I don't think even with the cap increasing in the next couple years, I don't think you're going to be able to pay everybody. Is Gorgui Dieng going to demand starting center money? Is Shabazz Muhammad, what does Shabazz Muhammad want for his career? Does he want to be a six man, or does he want to have the opportunity to start somewhere else? I think in order of dissatisfaction with their spot, I think Shabazz is at the top. I definitely think he was a valuable trade asset that could have been moved for some tangible return prior to the deadline, but they just haven't done that. But if I'm picking a big three, it's going to be Wiggins, Towns, and Levine, and everything else from that point on is about who you can plug in around them to make the team successful.
He is the man, Zachary Bennett. Be sure to check him out. He covers the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Minnesota Lynx at ColdOmaha.com. Also runs with the Hardwood Paroxysm Basketball Network. Zach, man, thanks for the awesome insight this week. And basically, the byline or the big headline is talent on hold with some serious question marks. And I would hate to think that this is a team with this kind of talent, this much excitement, gets stalled because of what's happening in the background with regards to this organization and the possible movements that might happen. What's your fear factor with regards to this team, not only at the end of the season, but moving forward after this conversation that we've had?
Competency, I guess. Is this new ownership group going to come in and screw everything up? But at the other end of the spectrum, you have the current ownership who's basically, timid and unwilling to make any sort of decisions. To alter your question, I think in a perfect world, somebody like Jeff Van Gundy, who we mentioned earlier, who apparently, I don't know what interview you were referring to when he said he would rather be the Magic than the Wolves because they were in the Eastern Conference. Jeff Van Gundy is actually he was a good friend of Flip Saunders. He was hanging around the practice facilities during the Lynx season last year, talking with head coach Cheryl Reeve, and has expressed interest recently in potentially coaching again, or if not coaching, being the president of basketball operations, or perhaps both. And I think in a perfect world, somebody like Van Gundy comes in, whether it be under a new ownership group or the current one. Van Gundy, a known basketball guy, can come in, and whether or not he wants to hire Thibodeau, who has ties with the current ownership, that would, in a perfect world, be an ideal situation for the Wolves. But as far as the original question, the fear is, are they going to take too long to make the right decision that will be best for the players moving forward? And are the players going to be annoyed by how long it's going to take that decision to be made? Or is the new ownership going to come in and screw it up and disrupt the chemistry that the current core has in place?
He is the man. Be sure to check him out at Zachary BD. Zach, man, thanks for hopping on with us and really digging in on things happening with the Minnesota Timberwolves this week, man.
Hey, Warren, Cal, thanks for having me. No problem. Happy to talk anytime.
All right, awesome. You're tuned to The Baseline. Cal Lee, Warren Shaw, discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. And this was The Breakdown. Time now for The Drop. Cal Lee, Warren Shaw of The Baseline NBA podcast. And the topic we have for this week's show regarding The Drop is in relation to a team in the dirty, not dirty jersey. We're talking about the Atlanta Hawks, and kind of a interesting scenario. Leading up to this year, everybody felt last year was pretty much almost an aberration. We're a little susceptible to the idea that they could replicate a 60-win season. But listen, the Atlanta Hawks, fantabulous job nonetheless, and I think it's definitely ironclad. Mike Budenholzer is on the come up as being one of the premier coaches in the league, given how he's able to take the talent, the roster that he has, and allow these guys to perform at such a high level. It's a shame that he just has to compete with the likes of a guy like a LeBron James and company to have to get through to maybe even realize the potential of what he has as a coach. But the bigger question going into this season was what was going to happen to this core that the Atlanta Hawks have had. And we've seen this piece by piece breakup. Joe Johnson out the door, Josh Smith out the door. We've seen Al Horford, Paul Millsap come into the mix, and then you have Jeff Teague, and it's a good mixture. But at some point, everybody is going to start throwing up the questions. And we thought that at the trade deadline for this year, a couple of pieces probably should have been moved. Al Horford and Jeff Teague, more importantly, their names being thrown in the hat during the trade deadline, but no movement to the avail. So, Shaw, the big question is, with the Atlanta Hawks keeping their core players, being that it's a Jeff Teague and Al Horford, was this a good move, not only for this year, but moving forward, given the contractual obligations and really just the overall team chemistry of what this team is capable of doing with these guys?
This is a great topic of conversation, because the Atlanta Hawks are a team that have habitually been in the playoffs and haven't had as much success, nearly as much as they had last year. But are they as good as they were a season ago? A 60-win team that can potentially get to to the Eastern Conference Finals. And there, like you said, there was a lot of conversation about this team and leading up to the trade deadline. Were they going to break up their core? And obviously, I guess we got our answer. Whereas they feel like, they're going to try to give this thing one more go. And by that I mean they're going to try to re-sign Al Horford, because remember, they still have the ability to sign him for 5 years as opposed to 4. You can still get the most amount of money by staying with the Atlanta Hawks. And then this is a year everybody's going to have money. So maybe they're going to be able to finally add another piece to that mix, if you will. Yes, there's this conversation and some future about whether Jeff Teague is an point guard of the future, and they can still deal with that one way or the other between he and Dennis Schroeder. But I think the key here is going to be them now thinking that, you know what, Al Horford is going to want to stay with us. They'll resign. They're going to try to resign him for, you know, a 5-year maximum deal, and then try to bring in another free agent, probably at that wing position, to try to propel them to the next step of whatever the Hawks think their success should be.
But Shaw, when you think about what has happened over the course of this season, and we're talking about how this Atlanta Hawks team has manifested itself, I think by default, they're going to be a playoff team. There's no question. Do you get the sense that even with the fans giving the kind of love and cheer that they had for them last year and going into this year, that it really would have been the worst case scenario in the world to not move along a Jeff Teague? I mean, there was the speculations about Dennis Schroeder now being the future point guard for this team. And we even saw it just the other night, you know, what he really is capable of when given the minutes. And clearly there has to be a point where you're looking at this team and you're saying the upside with Schroeder is there. With Teague, we basically know what Teague is going to give us with this team in Compass. And we all know that the point guard position manifested is the point guard position, the position. I would say yes. Without a true point guard and navigate guys that are not playmakers, Al Horford needs a play creator. Paul Millsap needs a play creator. They're going to have to do something at some point, and you'd have thought this would have been the perfect time for them to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that assessment. I think that the issue with Teague is, you know, no matter whatever you decide you're going to do as an organization as the Atlanta Hawks, Teague is probably somebody who you may or may not, you know, think is really part of the future. And if you believe in Dennis Schroeder, then Teague is somebody they probably should have moved and gotten some pieces for. You know, whether that's, you know, a draft pick, whether that's, you know, some wing help, and then they can let Schroeder kind of run the point guard position. That's where the only thing I think they kind of missed out on, because they seem to be unsure about Teague. And if you're unsure, then you should have moved them on and gotten some pieces that could have helped you build on your team for the future. With Schroeder, then you try to retain Horford, and then you try to maybe bring in another free agent at the wing position as well. So I think they missed the boat there with that. But again, we don't know exactly what the summer is going to hold. And obviously they can still make moves. They can make move around the draft, and then obviously in the summer as well too. So, but for this year, they're going to go ahead and ride out with this roster. And again, like I said, I'm saddened only because I wanted to see some movement happen, but I do think like they missed the boat in moving Teague on and potentially, you know, getting something to kind of really, really help their roster moving forward in the summer.
No, I'm just kind of saddened more on the fact that the Atlanta Hawks have these little small opportunities to do something to kind of give people an idea of what this Hawks team needs to be for the next 3 years moving forward. I get it. You know, there's some teams in the NBA that need a track record of success, but the Atlanta Hawks are in a division very viable. I think if you said, all right, I can't move Al Horford and Paul Millsap, I get that, because arguably, at least from my perspective, in the Eastern Conference, the combination of Paul Millsap and Al Horford is probably a top 3. You can probably give credence to. I would say top 3, the very worst, top 5 front court combination in the Eastern Conference. I'm not talking NBA, just in the Eastern Conference. And I think given their experience, their veteranship, their playoff experience, hard pressed for you to just give that away when you're in contention. But Jeff Teague has always been that anomaly. And yet you need an X factor guy. They tried it last year with Kyle Korver, and clearly you can only get so much from Kyle Korver. And you can clearly see this year his numbers are completely down. So let's not even, you know, it's kind of like having like Mike Dunleavy on your team, basically. He'll give you maybe one good year, one good spurt. Outside of that, your wing players, you're not giving Mike Scott any confidence that he's going to be your premier wing guy. You're going to rely on Kent Bazemore, Tybal Cephalosha. That's shooting guard, 2 guard by committee. So Jeff Teague is your X factor. And to your credit, Shaw, you said he probably is the one guy you can move and get some pieces for. My thing is that if you're the Atlanta Hawks, You've got pieces that you can clearly develop and clearly give opportunity for them to help kind of mold a new Atlanta Hawks, mold that vision for people to buy into. That's what it took the last couple of years when Danny Ferry was the general manager. But because this now general manager has not pulled the trigger, it almost makes it seem like they're waiting. And if they wait too long, that window that they had to kind of give people an idea of what that vision is going to be might get blinded by what everyone else is doing in the Eastern Conference.
Well, I mean, I think that's part of the key, though, is what everybody else is doing in the Eastern Conference. And whereas you feel like, you know what, I think their situation was, why should we change? Why should we blow anything up right now when we have a potential to compete in the East this year? It's wide open. As we've said many times on this show, and as many people have heard throughout the media this year, basically 2 through 10 is a crapshoot. Anything can happen the rest of the season. And Atlanta Hawks are sitting firmly in the middle of the Eastern Conference race right now. And they feel like, you know what, maybe they can just kind of work from within, work out some things. Korver's been injured most of the year, and they're still trying to work Tim Hardaway Jr. into the rotation one way or the other. And they just feel like this is a team that has a chance to really compete in the Eastern Conference. I don't necessarily happen to agree with that assessment, but I feel like because the Eastern Conference is so wide open, that's where they sit right now. And they say, you know what, we can make a strong run at this. And maybe if they do make another strong run, that is attractive to free agents out there. And that can also help them in the summer as well. So you got to give them credit for, their own belief in themselves. We'll have to see if it actually comes to fruition, but I'm just not a big believer in this roster as it currently is, as it's currently constructed, to think that they can get out of the Eastern Conference.
Yeah, Shaw, but look, I completely agree with everything that you're saying, but my caveat is this. You don't have DeMarre Carroll. DeMarre Carroll gave you 70 games last year, averaged around 13 points per game, 5 rebounds. He shot 48% from the floor. You don't have that, right? You're trying to, I guess you could say, mold that with a combo of Kent Bazemore and Tybal Cephalosha. And to me, if that was the idea, because we're talking about how the Eastern Conference is a crapshoot 2 through 8, the problem that I have with is, even if you are in 2 or you're in 8, eventually you're going to have to roll up against the Cleveland Cavaliers. If you got all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals and you got waxed and you had a DeMarre Carroll on your team, where would the market improvement of your basketball team give the idea or the perception that you're going to have an opportunity to best the Cleveland Cavaliers? Let's keep in mind the Cleveland Cavaliers have personnel, right? They've got players. Oh, and they also have arguably the best player in the game of basketball in LeBron James. He may not look like that this year, but when the time comes, we know what he's capable of giving. Who do the Atlanta Hawks truly have? That's what I'm saying. Like, to me, if you weren't able to keep DeMarre Carroll and you're relying on Teague, Hofford, and Millsap, you're still going to need to do something at the trade deadline to give yourself the same kind of opportunity that you would have needed to actually give yourself a chance that you had last year that you couldn't do when you had the chemistry and the ensemble cast that you had. This is clearly not the same team that was last year, even though you may still have a Dennis Schroeder and a Mike Scott. 2 of your core players that played above their heads last year are marketably playing below their level this year. So if you're going to rely on that idea or that premise alone, well, yeah, you know what? 45, maybe 50 wins this year is great, but it's still going to put you right back where you started, which is you may run into the Cleveland Cavaliers at some point and you're going to wind up getting knocked out of the playoffs. I just find that to be a hard sell, given this is what people were being sold on when they had the big trio of Josh Smith, Joe Johnson, and Al Horford, and that didn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. They understand that at some point to get out of the Eastern Conference, it's the road. All roads lead through Cleveland. Where they finish depends on how soon, if at all, if they meet Cleveland in the playoffs one way or the other. And yeah, they do need some wing help, and that's why you heard some of the names being thrown out there. I think Teague was being mentioned potentially going to Utah in exchange for Alec Burks. And if he could have came back and been a wing presence for them, although he's not a defensive stalwart, he's someone who can put pressure on the defense, and he can also create a little bit. I don't know that Atlanta's completely out of it. Maybe somebody shakes loose in a buyout. Maybe somebody shakes loose from the Chinese Basketball Association, and they maybe try to address that. Maybe they go to the D League and maybe there's a defender that they can get. at that wing position to kind of help them in any potential matchups that they would potentially have against the Cleveland Cavaliers. But the fact remains is, yeah, you're right. They didn't do anything. They haven't improved that position for them. And yes, it is a little bit ominous. Bazemore's had flashes this year, but he's not the answer. And Cephalosha, same thing. He's supposed to be a defensive first type guy. He's been in and out of the lineup and then the rotation. Obviously, we know Kyle Korver's had to struggle with the shooting. Tim Hardaway Jr. has spent some time in the D League and just now starting to get some minutes in the regular rotation. That's the position where they're going to be hurting the most at. And if they don't improve it, you're right. They're not going to have any chance of getting anywhere in the Eastern Conference. But again, I think they're playing, for this season, and then they wanted to keep their core intact to see what they can do in future seasons. And that's why they didn't want to trade anybody away.
All right, the Atlanta Hawks currently, as we record this podcast, are sitting at 31-26, 10 games out of the Cleveland Cavaliers in the Eastern Conference picture, but definitely among one of the top teams in the Southeastern Division. It's going to be an interesting run. We don't know how far this team can really take themselves, but if there's an expectation that this team is going to compete at a high level, the play of Jeff Teague, the consistency of Kyle Korver, the improved play of Kyle Korver and the consistency of Al Horford are tantamount. Without those guys stepping up during this second part of the season, going into the playoffs and giving themselves momentum, they have really no chance. And I fear the one thing that may happen to this Atlanta Hawks team is that this is a team that's capable of getting knocked out of the first round if they don't have the right matchup. This is a good basketball team, but they're not playing like the basketball team that they were last year. And if they don't, like we said, that crapshoot that we're talking about, basically we're saying that the Atlanta Hawks are not above the Boston Celtics. They're not above the Miami Heat. They can easily be had. They're probably not even above the Bulls or the Hornets or the Pacers. So they could easily be had by any one of these guys simply by the matchups and the player matchups that'll manifest itself. You're tuned to The Baseline. Cal Lee, Warren Shaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. And this was The Drop.
Coast to coast.
Time now to go coast to coast discussing the news in the association. You ready to rock and roll, Mr. Shaw?
Absolutely, man. Let's ride.
All right. Don't buy we out. My man Sean Paul probably is just loving this first byline of our first coast to coast segment. It's buyout season. David Lee, J.J. Hickson, Andre Bargnani, Anderson Varejao, Steve Novak, all considered free agents, and there is rumors that Joe Johnson is also on the buy we out list. Shaw, what do we make about this, man? It's a complete buyout season right now for some quality players.
Yeah, man, it really is a great time if you're a veteran, guy out there, and teams are looking out for your best interest because they feel like you're not going to help them. So they're, we're going ahead and move you on so you can potentially go to a playoff team and figure out where you're going to go. And I think the biggest name right now out there is Anderson Varejao. He's being linked to the Golden State Warriors, and if that's something that happens, I think Golden State is, they're going to be paying a heavy luxury tax penalty as a result of that signing. But with Bogut being kind of, injury prone as he is and is now suffering another injury, I think Varejao and Golden State makes a lot of sense for them too. I don't know if we'll see Bargnani anywhere. Don't know if or where we'll see J.J. Hickson anywhere. But definitely Varejao is going to have a market. Steve Novak is being linked to the Milwaukee Bucks as well to provide them some shooting. The Heat might be interested in him as well if things in Milwaukee don't pan out. So these guys are going to definitely find a job. And if Joe Johnson ends up getting bought out, look for Miami and the Clippers to be the first in line to try to sign him.
Also, Shaw, I've heard that David Lee may be linked to the Dallas Mavericks. How good of a fit could he be for the Mavericks, given the slide that they've had going up to and then even after the All-Star break?
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting fit, I think. I didn't see Dallas coming as a potential fit for him. I was looking at the Heat and looking at the Toronto Raptors potentially, but it looks like the Mavericks are going to slide in there, and he wants playing time, and he'll get that. I think he could get a little more playing time in Miami or Toronto, but nevertheless, I think he just feels like the Dallas might be a better situation, good organization, obviously playing with Dirk as well, just a good group of guys that I think he can fit in with. So I think he'll go there and play pretty well, and the Dallas Mavericks should get a nice little boost if he's coming off of their, going to be one of their 6 men. Definitely can help their offense and well, not so much their defense, but definitely their rebounding as well.
Yeah, and listen, might even give Rick Carlisle some Mad Hatter ideas, possibly moving David Lee to the 5. Remember, he played the 5 when he was Golden State, played the 5 when he was part of the New York Knicks, and making making that smaller lineup work might actually bode well for a Mavericks team that at times doesn't offer the versatility against certain matchup teams like the Golden State Warriors and teams like the Portland Trailblazers. So it should be very interesting down the stretch if David Lee winds up with the Dallas Mavericks. One thing about the Joe Johnson thing, Shaw, real quick before we move on to the next item of business, does it surprise you that Joe Johnson at this point might be available, and that because of that casualty, that the Cavaliers will again have missed out on an opportunity to get maybe that perimeter shooter to put him over the top for a possible championship?
Well, I mean, again, I'm remiss in that, I think, because I think the Cavs have some interest in as well. For some reason, though, I feel like Joe Johnson, the word on the street is he likes his money. So he's not really willing to accept a buyout where he's going to take anything less than what is owed to him on his contract. So he's willing to kind of play it out in Brooklyn, no matter how bad they are the rest of the season. He's not necessarily concerned about, joining a championship team. He feels like maybe that's something he can do next season after his contract is over. So he's really the holdup here. He doesn't seem right now to be wanting to accept a buyout, but things could change, between now and he'd have to actually sign a deal between now and March 1st so that he'd be playoff eligible. But I think the Cavaliers will definitely be heavy pursuers if it indeed does happen. But Joe Johnson, like I said, he's the one who's holding things up right now.
Yeah, well, listen, Sean Marks is definitely one of those dudes I think is not afraid to figure out a way to pull that trigger. So if Andrea Bargnani is out the door, don't be surprised if Sean Marks doesn't kind of, bully his way into making something happen to get Joe Johnson out the door as well too. All right, Sean, let's go ahead and talk D-League. A couple of call-ups, man, and kind of weird, man. Like, we had our man jump on Chris Riker. Yeah, he did an excellent job talking about how there's some D-League prospects and there should be quite a few signups. But the movement's been kind of scarce, especially leading up to the trade deadline. And we would probably have thought that maybe some rosters would get bolstered, some extended 10-day contracts. But Phil Presley and Alex Stevenson have been signed up. One, Phil Presley to the Suns. Clippers signed Alex Stevenson. What do you make about these call-ups? And is this now trending us back to the idea that the D-Leaguers should start getting a little bit of movement as we start nearing towards the end stretch run?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and for those specific teams, they needed desperate help with the players that they have. Archie Goodwin is not a true point guard, and the Phoenix Suns realize that. So they're going to give Phil Pressey, a veteran guy out there, a shot to come and maybe bolster that second unit a little bit. And we'll see if he ends up sticking and being there for the rest of the season. But Archie Goodwin is really struggling at the point guard position right now. And then for the LA Clippers, hey, they know they're without Blake Griffin. Rebounding with DeAndre Jordan is obviously a great rebounder, but they struggle with rebounding outside of him. Stevenson is a guy who was leading the D League in rebounding, so he can come in there and potentially give some spot minutes and help do some cleanup duty, especially on the glass. So both of these these call-ups rather make a lot of sense for the two teams that have done it, and we may see a few more coming up in the coming weeks as well.
All right, and finally, Shaw, New Orleans Pelicans, they have made sure that their man Bryce Dijon-Jones is going to stay a Pelican. A lot of that hard work paying off. Another D-leaguer, but he now gets signed to a 3-year deal. Good vibes out there and well-deserved. I mean, this guy definitely came in, filled in some great minutes for Tyreek Evans, helped this Pelicans team stabilize themselves when they were free-falling. And even though this season might be considered a lost season, there may be a big gain in getting a guy like Bryce Dijon-Jones implemented into that Gentry system.
Yeah, he's played well for them, and we'll see how long he's there. I don't know the full deals of the 3 years, if it's all guaranteed or what the deal is with that. I can't imagine that it would be, but nevertheless, Dijon-Jones has definitely helped them out, and especially in lieu of Tyreek Evans being out for the remainder of this season as well. Gives him some perimeter help and a guy who can really look at defense first, and he can score a little bit too as a slasher. So nice selling for New Orleans Pelicans. They should be getting Eric Gordon back pretty soon as well too. So we'll see what Dijon-Jones will be, his role will be after Gordon gets back. But you're right, 100%. The Pelicans are in a situation where they need as much help as they can get, and he definitely is providing that for them.
Talk about buying me out season. I know Eric Gordon's name should have been put on that, but
oh my God,
that's left. That's another topic for another conversation that we hope will get fed through our wire, that we have discussion. Maybe not even on a coast to coast possible, right?
Right, for real, man.
Excellent show this week, Shaw. Some really good stuff. And even though the news was somewhat quiet, now we've got our eyeballs peeled, because while the trading trading season is up and has been very quiet, the trade deadline, the buyout season might actually shake things up a little bit. And we know this because we're pretty much set on the teams that we're looking at as far as the Eastern and Western Conference playoff picture. There's a couple of spots that probably are going to be remaining seen. I think it's just going to be a matter of seeding. But now with the buyouts, we're going to see who really is looking to improve their rosters, who's really seriously taking into consideration about doing what's necessary to make that run. You know what, Shaw? Even teams like the Boston Celtics, the Miami Heat, these guys have got opportunities to at least improve their chances by putting a veteran guy who knows how to win basketball games, has got some playoff experience on the roster, and to help these young guys figure out ways to win games when they matter the most.
Yeah, I mean, teams that are going for their playoff spot and looking for seeding, everybody has, especially in the Eastern Conference, everybody has weaknesses. And, a lot of it is shooting. Some of it is size, post play, whatever. So if any of these guys shake loose and you can get them on a veteran minimum deal, something that's not going to impact your cap too much, unless you're the Golden State Warriors and you're just going for it anyway. You should definitely give some of these players a shot. And I think we'll definitely see some movement as we alluded to a little bit earlier. I think Bargnani, for what he is, if you still feel like he can shoot, you still think he can rebound, then he's definitely a guy who can help you somewhere. I'm not saying the Celtics or anybody like that are going to go after him, but there definitely are some players out there who can help teams out there that are trying to improve their playoff seeding. So let's see what happens, man. It should be a good final 25 games or so here as we get to the stretch run, and I can't wait to see where everybody ends up.
Definitely. So once again, we'd like to thank our man Zach Bennett for jumping on with us. Great conversation discussing the Timberwolves. And my man Shaw and I, we always appreciate you guys hopping on. For the Baseline, Cal Lee, Warren Shaw, we appreciate you guys. And we'll catch up with you next time.